The year was 2347, and humanity had finally become a spacefaring species. They had built colonies on 12 different worlds. They had constructed a fleet of 200 warships. They believed they were alone in the vast darkness of space. They were wrong. Commander Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the USS Relentless, the largest carrier in the human fleet. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent 30 years in the Navy and had never seen real combat. None of them had. Humanity had been at peace for over a century. The screens in front of him showed nothing unusual, just the normal patrol routes around Earth, just the quiet hum of a ship doing its duty. He took a sip of his coffee and watched the stars drift by. Then every alarm on the ship went off at once. Lieutenant Samantha Blake was the first to see it. She was young, only 26, with short brown hair and quick hands. Her job was to monitor the long-range sensors. She had never seen anything like what appeared on her screen. "Commander," she said, her voice shaking, "we have contacts, multiple contacts." Hayes walked over to her station. "How many?" She looked up at him with fear in her eyes. 3,000, sir. Maybe more." The ships came out of nowhere. They were massive, each one bigger than anything humanity had ever built. They moved in perfect formation, like a swarm of metal insects crossing the void. They stopped at the edge of the solar system and waited. On Earth, Admiral Catherine Lawson received the transmission at Fleet Command in Geneva. She was 62 years old and had gray hair that she kept in a tight bun. She had commanded the human fleet for 15 years and had always hoped she would never have to use it for war. The message played on the main screen. The creature that spoke was tall and covered in dark scales. It had 4 arms and eyes that glowed red. It called itself Thexural, Supreme Commander of the Vornak Dominion. "Humans," it said in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against metal, "you are now subjects of the Vornak Dominion. You will surrender your homeworld. You will surrender your colonies. You will surrender your fleet. You have 72 hours to comply. If you do not, we will burn your cities to ash and sell your children as slaves. This is not a negotiation. This is your only warning." The transmission ended. Admiral Lawson stood in silence. Around her, the staff of Fleet Command waited for her to speak. Some of them were crying. Some of them were praying. All of them were afraid. She picked up her communicator and called President Nathan Cole. Cole was a former soldier himself. He had fought in the last war on Earth, the one that had finally united humanity under one government. He was 70 years old now, but his voice was still strong. "I saw it," he said before Lawson could speak. "What do we know about them?" "Nothing, sir. They appeared out of nowhere. Our sensors show their ships are more advanced than anything we have. Their weapons, their shields, their engines. We are outmatched in every way." There was a long pause. "How many ships do they have?" "Over 3,000, sir. We have 200. Another pause. Lawson could hear the old man breathing on the other end of the line. "Catherine," he finally said, "I am going to address the people of Earth. I am going to tell them we are not going to surrender. Can you give me a chance? Can you fight them?" Lawson closed her eyes. She thought about her daughter, who lived on the Mars colony. She thought about her grandchildren, who had never known war. She thought about every man and woman in her fleet who had signed up to protect humanity. "I can give you a fight, sir. I cannot promise you a victory. That is all I ask." President Cole addressed humanity 1 hour later. His face appeared on every screen, in every home, on every ship. He stood behind a simple podium with the flag of Earth behind him. "My fellow humans," he began, "today we received a message from a species called the Vornak. They have told us to surrender. They have told us to kneel. They have told us that we have no choice." He paused and looked directly into the camera. "They are wrong." His voice grew stronger. We did not crawl out of the mud of Africa to kneel before tyrants. We did not survive ice ages and plagues and wars to become slaves. We did not reach for the stars to hand them over to monsters. Earth does not surrender. Humanity does not break. We will fight them with everything we have. And if we die, we will die on our feet, not on our knees. The speech lasted only 5 minutes. When it ended, something changed across the human worlds. Fear turned into anger. Despair turned into determination. The species that had invented war now prepared to wage it on a scale they had never imagined. Lieutenant Commander Scott Morrison was in charge of fleet coordination. He was a skinny man with glasses and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers, but he was the best at his job. Within hours, he had sent orders to every human vessel in the 12 colonies. All ships are to return to Earth immediately. This includes cargo ships, mining vessels, passenger liners, and exploration craft. Anything that can fly is needed. Anything that can fight will fight. At the Armstrong Lunar Shipyard, Chief Engineer Rebecca Torres worked without sleep. She was a short woman with dark hair and oil-stained hands. Her job was to build ships, but now her job was to turn peaceful vessels into weapons of war. She stood in the main hangar and looked at the 100 civilian ships that had arrived for retrofit. Mining lasers could become weapons. Cargo holds could carry missiles. Engine cores could be overloaded to turn a ship into a bomb. "How long do we have?" asked her assistant, a young man named Peter Hoffman. 72 hours. That is not enough time. Torres picked up a welding torch and lit it. Then we do not sleep. Across Earth, the same scene played out in every factory, every shipyard, every military base. Ancient weapons were pulled out of museums. Retired soldiers put their uniforms back on. Young people who had never held a gun learned how to fire one. When the 72 hours ended, the Vornak Armada moved toward Earth. Sub-Admiral Catherine Lawson had chosen the Kuiper Belt as her battlefield. It was the ring of ice and rock at the edge of the solar system, filled with thousands of frozen objects. Her ships could hide among them. They could use them as cover. They could turn the darkness into a trap. Captain Christopher Grant commanded the destroyer squadron. He was a big man with a shaved head and a scar that ran down the left side of his face. He had gotten that scar in a training accident 20 years ago. He had never seen real combat. None of them had. His 10 destroyers were hidden among the frozen rocks, their engines cold, their systems running on minimal power. They were invisible to enemy sensors. They were waiting. "Hold your positions," Lawson said over the secure channel. "Let them come to us." Supreme Commander Thexeral watched the human fleet on his display. They were clustered together near a large asteroid, their ships forming a tight defensive formation. He had seen this behavior before. Prey animals did this when they were afraid. They huddled together for comfort before they died. "They are making this easy," said Fleet Marshal Krenvax, his second in command. Krenvax was smaller than Thexeral, with darker scales and a long tail that dragged on the floor behind him. He had served the Dominion for 40 years and had helped conquer 11 species. "Too easy," Thexeral replied, but he pushed the thought aside. These were primitive creatures who had only been in space for a few centuries. They had no experience fighting a real war. They would break like all the others. He ordered his armada forward in standard conquest formation. The 3,000 Vornak ships spread out in a massive crescent, designed to surround and crush the enemy from all sides. It was the same formation that had won them 63 wars. Lieutenant Samantha Blake sat in the cockpit of her fighter craft. Her squadron of 40 pilots waited in the launch bay of the USS Relentless, their engines humming, their weapons armed. She was the squadron leader. It was her job to lead them into battle. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking on the controls. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She had trained for this moment her entire career, but training was not the same as reality. In training, you did not die. The order came through her headset. All fighters, launch! Blake pushed her fear down into her stomach and hit the throttle. Her fighter shot out of the launch bay and into the void. Behind her, 39 pilots followed. They did not attack the enemy ships directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, they dove straight through the Vornak formation, weaving between the massive cruisers and dreadnoughts. As they flew, they released small drones from their cargo bays. The drones were not weapons. They were jammers. They sent out waves of electromagnetic noise that scrambled Vornak's sensors. Within seconds, the enemy fleet was blind. Thexerl stared at his display in confusion. One moment he could see everything. The next moment, his screen was filled with static and ghost signals. "What is happening?" he demanded. "Unknown, Supreme Commander. Our sensors are being disrupted by some kind of interference." "Clear it." "We are trying, sir. It appears to be coming from multiple sources. We cannot—" The first Vornak cruiser exploded before anyone could finish the sentence. Captain Grant had brought his destroyers up behind the enemy fleet while they were focused on the human main force. His ships rose from the asteroid field like ghosts, their railguns already firing. Railguns were simple weapons. They used electromagnetic force to launch chunks of metal at incredible speeds. No energy beams, no plasma bolts, just solid pieces of steel moving fast enough to punch through anything. The Vornak shields were designed to deflect energy weapons. They had never faced kinetic projectiles at these velocities. The first salvo tore through 3 cruisers like they were made of paper. Krenvax watched the destruction in horror. "Impossible," he whispered. "Their weapons are primitive. They should not be able to penetrate our shields." But they were, and they kept firing. Commander Daniel Hayes brought the USS Relentless into the center of the enemy formation. The carrier was too big to hide and too slow to dodge, so he did the only thing he could do. He charged straight at the enemy and dared them to stop him. The Relentless launched wave after wave of fighters and bombers. They swarmed around the Vornak ships like angry insects, hitting them from every angle. The enemy could not target them because their sensors were still scrambled. They fired blindly into the dark and hit nothing. Ensign Patrick Nguyen was 23 years old. He had joined the Navy because his father had been a sailor. He had never thought he would die in space. His fighter took a hit from a stray energy bolt. The left engine exploded. The cockpit filled with smoke. His navigation systems went dead. He was spinning out of control toward a Vornak command ship. He could have ejected. He could have tried to survive. Instead, he aimed his damaged fighter at the command ship's engine core and pushed his remaining engine to maximum. "For Earth," he said quietly. The explosion took out the entire ship. The battle lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of chaos and fire and death. When it was over, the human fleet had lost 87 ships. 4,000 men and women were dead. But scattered across the Kuiper Belt floated the wreckage of 600 Vornak vessels. Thexerl stared at the damage reports in silence. He had lost a fifth of his fleet to a species that had been in space for less than 300 years. He had lost more ships in one battle than the Dominion had lost in the previous 10 wars combined. Krenvax stood beside him, his scales pale with shock. "Supreme Commander, we should send word to the homeworld. Request reinforcements." "No." Thexerl's voice was hard. "We do not need reinforcements to defeat these creatures. We were careless. We underestimated them. It will not happen again." He turned to his tactical officer. "Regroup the fleet. We push forward at dawn. We will burn their colonies one by one until they learn to kneel." On the USS Relentless, Admiral Lawson held a memorial service for the dead. She read every name aloud. It took 2 hours. When she was finished, she looked at the tired faces of her surviving crew. "We hurt them today," she said. "We hurt them badly. They came here thinking we were easy prey. They thought we would break. We did not break. We stood and we fought and we made them bleed. Tomorrow they will come again." and we will make them bleed again. This war is not over. It has only just begun. Captain Grant stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. He had lost 4 of his 10 destroyers, 40 good people under his command. But he had also killed hundreds of enemy ships. Mars was humanity's second home. 6 million people lived under its domed cities and inside its underground tunnels. The planet's orbit was surrounded by shipyards where half the human fleet had been built. If Mars fell, humanity would lose its ability to make new ships. The war would be over before it truly began. Governor Timothy Chen received the evacuation order 3 days before the Vornak arrived. He was a short man with white hair and a calm voice. He had been governor for 12 years and had never faced anything worse than a dust storm. Now he had to save 6 million people. The evacuation ships launched around the clock. Women and children first, then the elderly and the sick, then anyone who could not fight. Chen stood in the command center and watched the departure logs scroll across his screen. 100,000 evacuated on the first day, 200,000 on the second. But there were still millions left when the enemy fleet appeared in the sky. All remaining personnel are ordered to shelter in place, Chen announced over the planetary network. Our military will defend this world. Stay calm, stay together. Humanity does not abandon its own. Colonel Marcus Webb commanded the ground forces on Mars. He was a black man in his 50s with a shaved head and a voice like thunder. He had served in the peacekeeping forces on 3 different colonies. He had never fought a real war, but he had studied every war in human history. His Marines fortified every position. They dug trenches in the red sand. They placed explosive charges in the tunnels. They set up gun emplacements on the crater rims. When the Vornak came, they would find not civilians hiding in fear, but soldiers ready to fight. Remember Thermopylae, Webb told his troops. Remember Stalingrad. Remember every time in history when the few stood against the many. We do not need to win. We just need to hold long enough for the fleet to break their siege. In orbit, Admiral Lawson deployed her remaining fleet around the shipyards. She had 113 ships left. The Vornak had over 2,000. The orbital battle began at dawn. Captain Laura Mitchell commanded the USS Dauntless, a heavy cruiser with a crew of 800. She was 45 years old with red hair and green eyes. Her ship was positioned at the front of the defensive line. The Vornak came in waves. They had learned from the Kuiper Belt. Their sensors were shielded now. Their formations were tighter. They absorbed the human attacks and kept pushing forward. Mitchell watched her shields drop under the constant bombardment. 50%, 40%, 30%. Captain, we cannot hold this position, her first officer said. We need to fall back. If we fall back, they break through to the shipyards. We hold. 20%, 15%. A Vornak dreadnought moved into range, its massive guns aimed directly at the Dauntless. Mitchell knew what was coming. She could see the energy building in the enemy weapons. She had maybe 30 seconds to live. She made her decision. All hands, abandon ship. I repeat, all hands, abandon ship. The crew ran for the escape pods. Mitchell stayed at the helm. Her first officer tried to drag her away, but she pushed him toward the pods. Someone has to steer, she said. She aimed the Dauntless at the dreadnought and pushed the engines to maximum. The crippled cruiser shot forward, trailing fire and debris. The Vornak tried to destroy it, but they were too slow. The Dauntless hit the dreadnought amidships. Both ships exploded in a ball of white fire. Mitchell's last transmission was recorded. Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. Tell my kids their mom died standing. The explosion created a gap in the Vornak siege line. Admiral Lawson immediately ordered supply ships through. For the next 11 days, she kept that gap open, feeding reinforcements and ammunition to the defenders below. On the surface, the Vornak landing craft descended like a swarm of metal locusts. They landed in the desert between the domed cities, deploying thousands of ground troops. The Vornak soldiers were larger than humans, standing 8 feet tall with thick scales and 4 arms. Each arm carried a different weapon. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, but they had never fought in tunnels. Sergeant Kevin Park led a squad of 12 Marines through the underground passages beneath Olympus Mons. He was a young man, only 28, with a thin face and sharp eyes. His squad had been trained for tunnel fighting. They knew these passages better than anyone. The Vornak moved through the tunnels in single file. They had to. The passages were too narrow for them to spread out. Their size became a weakness. Park's squad hit them from behind. They fired and moved, leading the enemy deeper into the maze. The Vornak followed, driven by anger and pride. They did not realize they were being led into a trap. The explosives went off when the enemy was directly above the main charge. The tunnel collapsed, burying 200 Vornak soldiers under 1,000,000 tons of rock. Park emerged from a hidden exit and looked back at the dust cloud rising from the crater. "That is for Captain Mitchell," he said quietly. But the real victory came from what his squad found before the explosion. They had captured a Vornak forward command post. Inside was a wealth of intelligence data. Chief Engineer Rebecca Torres, now stationed aboard the USS Relentless, spent 3 days analyzing the captured files. She had not slept since the siege began. Her eyes were red, and her hands shook from too much coffee. On the 3rd day, she found it. "Admiral," she said, rushing onto the bridge, "I found a weakness." Lawson looked up from her tactical display. "Explain." "The Vornak shields work on a specific frequency. It is the same frequency on every ship. If we can create a weapon that disrupts that frequency, their shields will fail." "Can you build such a weapon?" Torres smiled for the first time in weeks. "Give me 48 hours. She worked with whatever she could find, salvaged Vornak components from destroyed ships. Human technology pushed beyond its limits. Parts that should not work together somehow did. On the 2nd day, she had a prototype. The resonance cannon was not elegant. It was ugly and bulky and barely fit on the Relentless. But when Torres tested it against a captured Vornak shield generator, the generator died instantly. "It works," she whispered. Admiral Lawson gave the order for a counterattack on the 12th day of the siege. Commander Daniel Hayes led the assault force, his ship armed with the new weapon. The Vornak were not expecting an attack. They had been on the offensive for so long that defense had become an afterthought. When the human fleet surged forward, they scrambled to respond. Hayes fired the resonance cannon at the lead Vornak dreadnought. The effect was immediate. The enemy shields flickered and died. The massive ship hung in space, suddenly vulnerable. Human railguns tore it apart in seconds. The Vornak formation broke. Without their shields, they were helpless against kinetic weapons. Ship after ship fell as the human fleet pushed forward. The enemy retreated, abandoning the siege, fleeing toward the outer planets. The war had been raging for 8 months when the first message arrived from the Thesari. Admiral Daniel Hayes was in his quarters when the communication officer called him to the bridge. He had been promoted after the Battle of Mars, given command of humanity's growing fleet. He was tired. They were all tired. But the message changed everything. The Thesari were a species of tall, thin beings with silver skin and large, dark eyes. They had been conquered by the Vornak 300 years ago. For 3 centuries, they had served as slaves, building ships and weapons for their masters. They had forgotten what freedom felt like. Until they saw what humanity was doing. "We have watched your battles," the Thesari ambassador said in the recording. His voice was soft and musical. "We have seen you fight an enemy that destroyed our civilization in a single month. You have stood against them for almost a year. You have made them bleed. This is something we did not believe was possible." He paused. and Hayes could see something in those large, dark eyes. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was hope. "We wish to speak with you. Perhaps there is still a chance for our people to be free." President Cole authorized the mission immediately. Ambassador Nicole Patterson was chosen to make contact. She was a small woman with gray hair and a fierce intelligence. She had spent her career negotiating trade deals and settling disputes between human colonies. Now she was about to negotiate the future of the galaxy. Patterson traveled to a secret meeting point in an uncharted system. The Thessery ship that met her was old and battered, held together by hope and desperation. The ambassador who greeted her was the same one from the recording. His name was Thessar Ill, and he had been born a slave. "Your people have done something remarkable," he told Patterson as they sat in his ship's small conference room. "You have given the galaxy something it has not had in 300 years. What is that? Hope." The Thessari were the first to join the alliance, but they were not the last. Within weeks, representatives from a dozen other conquered species made contact. The Kelrak were warriors whose homeworld had been burned to ash. The Moravians were scientists who had been forced to develop weapons for the Dominion. The Crystalline Collective was a silicon-based species that communicated through light and sound. They had been harvested for their bodies, which made excellent computer components. All of them had one thing in common. They had been watching humanity fight. They had seen the impossible become possible, and they wanted to be free. The Coalition of Free Worlds was formally established on the anniversary of the Vornak Ultimatum. 12 species signed the charter, pledging to fight together until the Dominion fell. They looked to humanity for leadership. Commander Hayes found himself promoted again, this time to Fleet Admiral of the combined Coalition forces. His first officer was Captain Stephanie Torres, Rebecca's younger sister. She was brilliant at tactics, and even better at handling the complex politics of species who had never fought, side by side. "The Kelrak want to lead every assault," she told Hayes during one of their daily briefings. "The Moravians want to hang back and provide technical support. The Crystalline Collective does not understand why we use verbal communication during battle. This alliance is going to fall apart before we fire a single shot." Hayes shook his head. "Then we make it work. Find common ground. Remind them why they joined us." "And what is that?" "They all want the same thing we want. They want to be free. They want their children to be free. Focus on that." It was not easy. The species had different cultures, different tactics, different ways of thinking. But slowly, under human guidance, they learned to fight together. The Vornak responded with fury. They deployed their slave soldiers, species that had been conquered so long ago they had forgotten any other way of life. Millions of them marched against the Coalition, forced to fight for the masters who had destroyed their worlds. Fleet Marshal Krenvax commanded the Dominion forces now. Supreme Commander Thex Ural had been executed for his failures. Krenvax was smarter and more careful. He used the slave soldiers as shields, forcing the Coalition to kill the very people they were trying to save. It was Admiral Hayes who found the solution. He broadcast a message to every slave ship in the Vornak fleet. It was simple and direct. "We are the Coalition of Free Worlds. We have come to end the Dominion. We know that you fight for them because you have no choice. But you do have a choice now. We will not kill those who are already victims. Join us or stand aside, but we will not add to your chains. Every slave who defects will be welcomed as a friend. Every slave who stands with the Dominion will be treated as a prisoner, not an enemy. This war is not against you. It is for you." The defections began slowly. A single ship here, a small group there. Then the flood came. Thousands of slave soldiers switched sides. They brought with them knowledge of Vornak defenses, supply lines, and troop movements. Krenvax watched his armies crumble from within. The Dominion's own strategy had turned against them. Operation Broken Dawn was the largest military offensive in galactic history. Coalition forces struck simultaneously at 12 different Vornak supply depots. Captain Brandon Wells led the assault on the primary fuel station, a massive structure orbiting a gas giant. Wells was a young man, only 32, with blonde hair and a reckless grin. He had been a cargo pilot before the war. Now he commanded an assault squadron of 50 ships. "All craft, this is Wells. Target is in range. Remember the plan. Fast in, hit hard, fast out. Nobody plays hero today." His squadron dove toward the station, weaving through defensive fire. The Vornak scrambled to respond, but they were too slow. Wells's ships reached the station and launched their missiles at the fuel storage tanks. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. Without fuel, half the Vornak fleet was stranded. Thousands of ships sat dead in space, their engines cold, their crews helpless. The Coalition picked them off one by one. On the bridge of the USS Ascendant, the newest and most powerful ship in the human fleet, Admiral Hayes received reports from across the front lines. Victory after victory. The Dominion was collapsing. The Coalition fleet arrived at Vornakis on a cold morning in the Dominion capital. Not that mornings meant much in space, but Admiral Daniel Hayes liked to think of it that way. It was the dawn of a new era, one way or another. Over 1,000 ships from 15 different species hung in formation at the edge of the Vornak home system. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and across from them, blocking the path to the homeworld, was every remaining ship the Dominion could muster. Fleet Marshal Krenvax had been preparing for this moment. He had called back every vessel from every conquered territory. He had activated ancient war machines that had not flown in centuries. He had even armed civilian ships and forced their crews to fight. His fleet numbered nearly 800 ships. It was not enough, but he had one last card to play. His communication reached the Ascendant just as the Coalition fleet was preparing to attack. Hayes listened with a cold expression as Krenvax made his offer. "Admiral Hayes, I propose a solution that benefits us both. Return to your own territories. Leave your allies behind. Humanity will be free. We will never threaten your worlds again. In exchange, you abandon those who joined your cause. They return to our rule. Their rebellion is forgotten." Captain Stephanie Torres stood beside Hayes, her fists clenched at her sides. "He wants us to betray everyone who trusted us." Hayes did not respond to her. Instead, he opened a channel to the entire Coalition fleet, making sure Krenvax could hear every word. "This is Admiral Hayes to all Coalition forces. The enemy has offered us a deal. They say humanity can go free if we abandon our allies." He paused. "Our answer is no. We did not fight this war to save ourselves. We fought it to end tyranny forever. We stand with our friends. We stand with the free. And we will stand until the Dominion falls." He closed the channel and gave the order. "All ships, attack." The battle was the largest and most violent in recorded history. Over 2,000 ships fought in the space around Vornakis, turning the void into a graveyard of fire and metal. Captain Christopher Grant led his destroyer squadron into the heart of the enemy formation. He had rebuilt his force after the losses at Mars, training new crews to fight the way humans fought, fast and hard and without mercy. His ships hit the Vornak flanks, drawing their fire away from the main assault. Grant knew what he was doing. He was sacrificing his squadron to create an opening. "All destroyers, maximum fire. Do not stop. Do not retreat. Make them remember us." One by one, his ships fell. But for every destroyer lost, 3 Vornak vessels died. Grant's ship was the last to go, its hull torn open by a concentrated barrage. His final order was to aim for the nearest enemy dreadnought. The collision destroyed both ships. Lieutenant Samantha Blake commanded a fighter wing now, 60 pilots under her authority. She had come a long way from the scared young woman who had led the first strike at the Kuiper Belt. Now she was one of the most decorated pilots in the fleet. Her wing targeted the planetary defense platforms, massive stations in orbit around Vornakis, each one capable of destroying a dozen ships. They had to be neutralized before the main fleet could approach the planet. Blake led the assault personally. Her fighter dove through a storm of defensive fire, weaving between energy blasts that could vaporize her in an instant. Behind her, her pilots followed, trusting her with their lives. "Target the power cores," she ordered. "One clean hit and the whole station goes down." She reached the first platform and launched her missiles at point-blank range. The explosion nearly caught her own ship. She pulled away just in time, her hull scorched and her shields gone. 3 platforms fell in the first wave, then 4 more. By the end of the hour, every orbital defense was destroyed. But the victory came at a cost. Blake had lost half her wing, 30 pilots, 30 friends. She did not allow herself to grieve. There would be time for that later, if there was a later. In the center of the battle, Admiral Hayes commanded from the bridge of the Ascendant. The ship was taking heavy fire, its shields flickering under the constant assault. Around him, officers shouted status reports and damage assessments. Chief Engineer Rebecca Torres was aboard, keeping the ship running through sheer willpower. She had not slept in 3 days. She had bypassed damaged systems, rerouted power, and held the ship together with duct tape and prayers. "Admiral, shields are at 15%. We cannot take much more of this." Hayes nodded grimly. "Hold together a little longer." "We are almost there." Admiral Catherine Lawson commanded the USS Determination, an older ship that had been with the fleet since the beginning. She was 63 now, and tired. But she had refused to retire. She had started this war. She intended to see it end. The Determination took position between the main coalition fleet and a Vornak assault group. The enemy ships were trying to break through to attack the vulnerable support vessels behind the front lines. "All power to forward shields," Lawson ordered. "We hold this line." The barrage hit her ship like a hammer. Systems failed. Fires broke out. Crew members died at their stations. Lawson stood firm, her hands gripping the command rail, her eyes fixed on the enemy. "Hold," she said. "Hold." The shields failed. The hull breached, the bridge filled with smoke and flame. Lawson's last order was to keep fighting. Her ship exploded, but it had done its job. The assault group was stopped. The support vessels were safe. The battle continued. Hayes watched the Determination die. He had served under Lawson for 20 years. She had been his mentor, his friend. Now she was gone. He pushed his grief aside. There would be time for that later. Right now, he had a war to win. The turning point came not from a weapon, but from words. As the battle raged, Hayes broadcast a message to the surface of Vornakis, not to the military, to the people. "People of the Vornak homeworld, your leaders told you that we were primitive, that we were weak, that we would break. They were wrong. Look at your sky. Look at the fire that burns there. That is your fleet dying. That is your empire falling. Your leaders brought this upon you. They chose conquest. They chose cruelty. They chose to enslave the galaxy. And now they are losing." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We do not come to destroy you. We do not come to enslave you. We do not seek revenge. We seek only freedom. For ourselves. For our allies. For every species that has suffered under your chains. Your empire ends today. But your people do not have to die with it. Choose peace. Choose freedom. End this war yourselves, and you will be welcomed into a new galaxy, one where all species are equal, one where no one kneels." The effect was not immediate, but it was powerful. On the surface of Vornakis, the common people had been watching the battle in the sky. They had seen their mighty fleet, the same fleet that had conquered 63 species, burning and falling. They had seen the coalition pushing forward, unstoppable, and they had heard the human admiral's words. The uprising began in the capital city. Workers who had spent their lives building weapons for the Dominion turned those weapons on their masters. Soldiers who had been forced to fight refused to obey orders. Crowds filled the streets, demanding an end to the war. Fleet Marshal Krenvax received word of the rebellion as his flagship took heavy damage from coalition attacks. His own officers were looking at him with doubt in their eyes. His own guards had their hands on their weapons. "Supreme Commander," his tactical officer said quietly, "it is over." Krenvax reached for his sidearm. He never got the chance to use it. His guards shot him before he could draw. The surrender came 3 hours later. The remaining Vornak ships powered down their weapons and opened their hangars for coalition boarding parties. The war was over. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of the Ascendant and watched as the Dominion flag was lowered from the orbital station above Vornakis. In its place rose a new flag, the banner of the Coalition of Free Worlds. He thought about everyone who had died to make this moment possible. Captain Mitchell, Captain Grant, Admiral Lawson, Ensign Nguyen, thousands of others whose names he would never know. They had given everything so that this day could come. The treaty was signed 3 weeks later. The Dominion was officially dissolved. 63 species, enslaved for centuries, were granted their freedom. The coalition would govern the galaxy with representatives from every species working together as equals. Hayes returned to Earth a hero, but he refused the title. He stood at the memorial dedication in Geneva, looking out at the crowd of humans and Thessari and Kellerak and Moravians. Behind him rose a monument bearing the names of every human who had fallen in the war. "I am not the hero of this war," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "The heroes are the names on this wall. The heroes are the ones who did not come home. They stood against the darkness. They refused to kneel. They died so that we could live free. We just finished what they started." At the base of the monument, a simple inscription was carved into the stone. They came to conquer Earth. They found humanity instead. 100 years later, the coalition remained the dominant power in 3 galaxies. Humanity had not become conquerors. They had become teachers, leaders, and defenders. The species that had once hunted each other across African plains now guided younger civilizations toward the stars. And in the great archives of Vornakis, a historian recorded the lesson that his ancestors had learned too late. Never threaten the human homeworld. They were born in fire. They were forged in conflict. They were tempered by adversity. When the galaxy tested them, they did not break. They simply reminded us all what it means to be human. The story of the Galactic War became legend, and at the heart of that legend was a simple truth that echoed through the ages. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not break. Humanity stands. Forever. Captain Torres stood beside him, reviewing the tactical data. "Sir, intelligence reports that the Vornak are pulling back all remaining forces to their homeworld. They are preparing for a final stand." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then that is where we go. It is time to end this." He looked out the viewport at the gathered coalition fleet. Ships from 15 different species, all flying together under one banner. Humans and Thessari and Kellerak and Moravians and a dozen others. They had come together to face a common enemy, and now they would finish what they started. The fleet began its journey toward Vornakis, the heart of the Dominion. The final battle was coming. One way or another, the war would end there. As the ships entered hyperspace, Hayes allowed himself a moment of reflection. 1 year ago, humanity had been given 72 hours to surrender. They had refused. They had fought. They had bled. And now they were leading a coalition of free species to liberate the galaxy. He thought about what President Cole had said in that first address. Humanity would not kneel. They would not break. They would die on their feet if they had to. But they were not going to die. They were going to win. Colonel Webb watched from the surface as the enemy ships disappeared into the darkness. Around him, his Marines cheered and wept and embraced each other. They had held. Against all odds, they had held. Admiral Lawson surveyed the debris field that filled Mars' orbit. Hundreds of ships floated dead in space, human and Vornak alike. The shipyards were damaged but not destroyed. The colony was scarred but not conquered. She opened a channel to Fleet Command on Earth. Geneva, this is Admiral Lawson. The siege of Mars is broken. The enemy is in retreat. There was a long pause. Then President Cole's voice came through, thick with emotion. "Well done, Admiral. Well done." Lawson looked at the stars and began planning something the Vornak had never expected. The humans were done defending. It was time to go on the offensive. "They will adapt," he said quietly to Hayes, who stood beside him. "They will figure out how to counter our tactics." Hayes nodded. "Then we will adapt too. That is what humans do. We learn. We improve. We overcome." "You think we can win this war?" Hayes looked at the stars through the viewport. Somewhere out there, 3,000 enemy ships were regrouping. Behind them lay the homeworld of an empire that had never known defeat. "I think we have to try," he said, "because the alternative is extinction." The Vornak armada moved toward Mars. The siege of humanity's second world was about to begin. Ream Commander Thexural looked at the human fleet arrayed against him. 200 ships against 3,000. He laughed. "They are either very brave or very stupid," he said to his officers. Admiral Lawson stood on the bridge of her command ship and watched the enemy approach. Behind her, 200 human vessels waited for her order. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. They were facing an empire that had conquered 63 species without ever losing a war. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. "All ships, this is Admiral Lawson. You know why we are here. You know what is at stake. The enemy expects us to break. They expect us to run. They expect us to die quickly and quietly. Let us show them how wrong they are. All ships, attack." The human fleet surged forward, and the first battle of the Galactic War began.